Caleb didn't answer immediately. His eyes were wide, locked on something below. Finally, without moving, he said quietly, "Did you see that?" I followed his gaze but saw nothing, just shadows tangled among dense bushes and branches. "See what?" "A man," Caleb muttered, his voice unsteady. "Barefoot. He was down there, staring right up at us." My heart sped up, the thought unsettling. "Where?" He pointed toward a dense patch directly below the midpoint of the log. My eyes scanned again, adjusting to the shadows. The forest below was still, empty. There was no movement, no sound, nothing. "Are you sure?" "Positive." Caleb finally moved forward, swiftly crossing to the other side. I joined him quickly, stepping onto solid ground with relief. Without speaking, we dropped our packs and scrambled carefully down the slope, pushing branches aside, searching. I felt a chill run through me as we reached the bottom. Nothing. No tracks, no disturbed brush, no evidence anyone had ever stood there. I looked at Caleb, whose face had turned pale. He shook his head slowly, clearly unsettled. "I swear, man, he was looking right at us." The feeling was uncomfortable, but daylight was still strong, and rational explanations were easy enough. "Maybe just shadows," I offered weakly, trying to ease the tension. Caleb didn't respond, just nodded slowly. We climbed back out and continued hiking. Neither of us talked much. Soon we reached our destination, a wide, shallow bend in Swift Camp Creek. After setting up camp, I organized the fishing gear while Caleb got a fire going. The silence was uneasy at first, but as we settled in, the atmosphere slowly returned to normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling we weren't alone. I was organizing tackle when I noticed something strange. The clasp on my tackle box hung loose. I distinctly remembered locking it earlier. Glancing toward Caleb, who seemed absorbed in tending the fire, I decided not to mention it. As darkness gathered around us, the comforting crackle of the fire and the familiar murmur of the creek eased my tension. Eventually we relaxed, trading old stories again until exhaustion set in. Crawling into my tent, I pushed away lingering anxiety. But even as I lay there, eyes heavy with sleep, I couldn't escape the image of that empty ravine. No matter how I rationalized, it felt as if something had begun out there, something quietly watching us from the shadows beneath the log. Sleep came slowly, unevenly. I drifted in and out, tangled in my sleeping bag, restless from the day's strange encounter beneath the log. Eventually, though, exhaustion won out. I fell into a shallow, dreamless sleep, broken only when I sensed something shifting nearby. My eyes snapped open, and I stared at the nylon ceiling of the tent, listening carefully. At first, all I heard was the distant murmur of the creek and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Normal sounds, familiar, comforting. But then something else reached my ears, faint but distinct. A quiet shuffling noise came from across the water. I held my breath, straining to catch it again. Silence returned, heavy and tense, until a soft voice drifted across the creek. A whisper, unmistakably clear. "Mason." I sat up quickly, heart hammering. Beside me, Caleb slept heavily, breathing slow and steady. I nudged him urgently. "Caleb, wake up," I hissed, my voice low but tight. He stirred sluggishly, eyes barely opening. "What?" he murmured, half asleep. "There's somebody outside," I whispered sharply, eyes fixed on the tent door. "Across the creek. Listen." Caleb paused, waiting in sleepy silence. Moments passed. Nothing. "Probably just animals, man," Caleb finally muttered, irritated. He rolled onto his side, pulling his sleeping bag higher. "Go back to sleep." Frustration bubbled up inside me, but I said nothing more. I sat rigid, listening as minutes dragged by. Just as I started convincing myself it had been my imagination, the voice returned, clear and measured, carrying through the darkness again. "Caleb." My pulse raced as I recognized the voice. An imitation. My voice echoed back at me, exact in pitch and tone. Caleb shifted uncomfortably now, eyes wide open. "What was that?" he whispered, now fully awake. "That's what I heard earlier," I replied quietly. "It called my name first." Caleb pushed himself upright, suddenly alert. "Is someone messing with us?" His voice shook slightly as he moved slowly toward the zipper of the tent door. "Wait!" I whispered urgently, reaching out to stop him. Just listen. We stayed still, hearts thudding. The silence stretched on painfully, punctuated only by the creak and the faint rustling of trees. Minutes passed. Nothing more came. Eventually my muscles relaxed, exhaustion creeping back despite my nerves. Maybe just campers downstream, Caleb said hesitantly, trying to convince himself more than me. Maybe, I replied, unconvinced. We lay down again, but I knew neither of us slept. Dawn finally broke after what felt like hours. The pale morning light brought relief and courage to exit the tent. We emerged slowly, scanning the opposite bank. It was quiet, still, no signs of disturbance in the brush or along the water's edge. Then Caleb's voice broke through sharply. "Hey, look at this." I turned. He was standing beside the fire ring, staring down. I joined him quickly, dread pooling in my stomach. Our firewood, carefully stacked and covered last night, was completely gone. Nearby, the rope we'd hung to dry our wet socks had been cleanly cut, the ends hanging loose, swaying in the breeze. "What the hell?" Caleb said quietly, anger masking his obvious fear. A few feet further away, I spotted something even stranger. One of my boots lay upside down in the dirt, about 20 feet from our tent. I picked it up, noticing immediately the faint imprint of bare toes pressed into the soft earth beside it. "We need to leave," I said firmly, my voice steady but tight. Caleb nodded without argument. We quickly packed our gear, glancing nervously around the quiet woods. We retraced our steps through the dense undergrowth, moving at a brisk pace. Neither of us spoke as we approached the ravine, desperate to put distance between ourselves and whatever had found us in the night. The morning was brighter now, reassuringly normal, until we reached the edge of the deep ravine and froze. The fallen log we'd crossed only yesterday afternoon was gone. It wasn't simply shifted or broken. It had vanished entirely, leaving a wide gap that looked impossible to cross. My chest tightened, panic rising. Caleb looked as shaken as I felt, pacing nervously along the edge. "It was here, right here," he insisted, voice rising. I glanced down at the soft earth where the log had rested, searching for any sign it had ever existed. There was nothing, no indentation, no scattered bark, not even broken branches below. It was as if it had never been there. Then my eyes landed on something that turned my blood cold. Near the edge, clear and fresh, were bare footprints pressed deeply into the damp soil. Beyond them, older and partially obscured by leaves, was another set of tracks, worn boot prints that vanished into a dense cluster of bushes. Caleb's breathing grew rapid as he pointed toward the brush. "Someone's watching us. They've been following us since yesterday." I didn't respond. I simply tightened my backpack straps, fighting back my fear as I turned away from the gap. There was no going back the way we'd come, not anymore. We were still miles from safety, with no clear path forward, and the quiet woods suddenly felt impossibly close, hiding eyes we couldn't see. We moved quickly, urgency overriding caution, trying to put as much distance between ourselves and the vanished log as possible. Every rustle of leaves behind us sent our heads snapping backward, eyes wide, scanning for anything or anyone following. Caleb kept muttering nervously, glancing at me every few minutes. "We need to move faster, Mason." "I know," I replied tightly, my own voice tense. The familiar landmarks had vanished, swallowed up by thick brush and unfamiliar terrain. We were lost, moving by instinct now, hoping to stumble onto the main trail before sunset trapped us here another night. By late afternoon, the forest had thickened, darker and denser. We broke through tangled branches and emerged into a small clearing edged with thick, thorny undergrowth. There was no clear path forward, and daylight was quickly fading. Caleb dropped his backpack heavily, frustration plain on his face. "We'll never make it back tonight," he said bitterly. "Not like this." I knew he was right, but dread filled me at the thought of spending another night in this place. Reluctantly, we agreed to set up camp where we stood, hidden among tall bushes and twisted saplings. We didn't speak as we set up the tent, both unwilling to admit our shared fear. There was no fire this time. We sat silently, chewing cold trail mix, knives resting at our sides, eyes constantly scanning the shadows around us. Night fell quickly, heavy and suffocating, the surrounding darkness absolute. Sleep wasn't an option. I sat upright, alert, listening. Beside me, Caleb shifted constantly, breathing unevenly. Time stretched endlessly until, sometime around midnight, I heard something approaching the tent. Soft, slow footsteps clearly audible on the forest floor. I reached silently for my knife, gripping it tightly, my heart pounding painfully in my chest. Caleb sat up abruptly, fully awake now. He opened his mouth, but I raised a finger sharply to silence him. Outside I heard quiet breathing, close. Someone was standing directly beside our tent. Then, a zipper moved, slowly, carefully, as if someone was testing it. Caleb lunged forward, grabbing his knife, eyes wide with terror. I reacted instinctively, gripping the zipper from our side, and tore it downward in a swift motion, bracing myself to confront whoever was outside. But no one was there. I stepped out cautiously, knife extended, scanning the clearing rapidly. Darkness surrounded us, dense and silent. My eyes adjusted slowly, drawn downward, where the soft earth clearly revealed fresh footprints. Bare feet had circled our tent repeatedly. Caleb stood beside me, pale and shaking visibly. "We need to leave right now," he whispered harshly. "Wait," I whispered back, eyes fixed on something else. A second set of tracks, heavy boot prints, led away into the darkness, toward a gentle slope. Instinctively we followed, flashlights trembling as we moved through the brush, stepping quietly but urgently. We emerged moments later onto a dirt embankment beneath Tunnel Ridge Road. A rusted metal drainage pipe loomed ahead, opening like a dark mouth beneath the road. The boot prints continued directly inside, disappearing into the blackness. Caleb stopped, staring at me in disbelief. "We can't go in there." I took a hesitant step forward, peering inside. From somewhere deep in the pipe, there was a faint wet sound, something shifting softly in the darkness. The noise sent a chill straight through me, and I stepped back quickly. "Let's get out of here," I whispered. We backed away rapidly, turning our backs to the drainage pipe and scrambling up the embankment, racing toward Tunnel Ridge Road. We didn't slow until we reached pavement, breaking into open air just as dawn began to break. Weak gray light creeping through the trees. The distant rumble of an engine brought relief. A forest ranger's truck rounded a corner slowly, and we waved frantically, stepping out onto the asphalt, desperate to be seen. The vehicle slowed to a stop, and the ranger stepped out, frowning deeply as he approached us. "You boys okay?" he asked, glancing at our disheveled clothing and pale faces. We began speaking simultaneously, words spilling out chaotically, describing the strange voices, the missing log, and the figures stalking us. The ranger listened quietly, his face growing increasingly grim. Finally, he raised his hand gently, signaling us to stop. "Boys, you're not the first ones," he said, his voice low and serious. "There have been stories for years. People go missing out here. The crossing log you mentioned, I've heard about it from others. Always the same." He paused, looking away, as if debating something silently. Then he spoke again, reluctantly. "Come on, show me." An hour later, we stood back at the ravine with 2 more rangers, sunlight illuminating the impossible gap before us. The ravine was far wider than it had been 2 days ago, and there was no sign, no mark or indentation, that any log had ever bridged it. "I swear it was here," Caleb insisted desperately. "We know," the ranger said quietly, examining the earth with a troubled look. "Like I said, you're not the first." Finally, we brought them to the drainage pipe. It sat quiet and empty in the daylight. I shivered as we stood at its entrance, my eyes adjusting again to the dim interior. Something caught my attention, scratches along the rusted metal walls. I stepped closer, heart quickening as I made out names etched crudely into the corroded surface. Some were barely legible, others clearer and fresher. I traced them slowly with shaking fingers until my hand stopped abruptly. I felt a rush of cold dread fill me. Caleb stepped closer, his eyes widening as he saw it too. Carved neatly, unmistakably into the rusted metal was my own name, Mason. I stepped back sharply, panic rising. I had never written it. I began, but my voice trailed off, caught in my throat. The ranger placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, guiding me away from the pipe, expression dark and sympathetic. "We're done here," he said firmly. "Let's go." As we walked back to the road, I knew without question that whatever was out there had marked me. We had escaped, yes, but not completely. Something from those dark woods had found us, followed us, and left behind a promise in my own name, scratched into rust and darkness beneath Tunnel Ridge Road. Flathead National Forest had always been our place. It was where my father had taught me how to hunt, fish, and survive. Every autumn, we'd leave civilization behind, heading deep into Montana's backcountry for elk season. My father, Dennis, was retired now, a firefighter who'd spent decades risking his life in smoke-filled buildings. Now in his 60s, he was still tougher than most men half his age. I'm Luke, and at 28 my job as a paramedic in Missoula kept me close to home, but far enough from wilderness that these annual hunting trips felt essential, almost sacred. This season, we chose an area we'd never hunted before, near the southern edge of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. Dad had heard from an outfitter friend that the bulls there were trophy-sized, and the valley itself was hardly touched. 2 days of hiking led us far from any marked trail, to a campsite at Timberline near a cold, winding stream that murmured quietly beneath granite ridges. After setting camp, we spent the evening planning our hunt. Dad had a good feeling about a shallow basin a mile farther in, nestled between thick stands of spruce and Douglas fir. We'd glassed elk in the distance, and with luck, we'd be packing out meat by the following afternoon. At dawn, the valley was draped in fog as we moved silently toward the basin. I had my Winchester Magnum slung over my shoulder, and Dad carried his trusty Remington. We'd barely broken the tree line when we spotted a herd, the bull massive and regal, his antlers silhouetted like skeletal fingers in the mist. A single shot rang out, clean and precise, and soon we stood beside the animal, marveling at its size. We dressed the bull carefully, lifting the heavy quarters into game bags before hoisting them into a nearby tree to keep predators at bay. It was exhausting work, and the sun was low by the time we finished. That night, the forest felt different. Even the sound of the stream seemed quieter, subdued by something I couldn't quite define. Just before turning in, I heard a distant crack echoing from the direction of our kill site, sharp, quick, and unnatural. Dad dismissed it as frost splitting wood, but I wasn't convinced. When morning came, the chill seemed sharper, seeping through my jacket as we returned to retrieve our meat. We pushed through the brush, expecting to see the white bags dangling where we'd left them. Instead, the tree stood empty, the ropes snapped and frayed, lying tangled on the ground beneath it. No blood, no scraps, just gone. "What the hell?" Dad whispered, circling the tree. I followed him closely, heart thumping. It was then that I noticed the marks, deep and distinct. 4 parallel grooves gouged into the bark, starting higher than either of us could reach. The cuts were fresh and rough, sap bleeding slowly down the trunk. "Bear couldn't do that," I muttered. Dad shook his head, lips pressed tight. He knelt and pointed. Through the forest floor stretched a set of drag marks, disturbed leaves and pine needles trailing toward darker timber beyond. Cautiously, we followed the trail. The drag marks faded gradually, becoming lighter until there was nothing but pristine ground again. No carcass, no bones, nothing. A faint rustle sounded somewhere ahead, so subtle that we froze instinctively. My pulse surged. We watched and listened, eyes scanning the trees, but nothing stirred. "We should head back," Dad said quietly. I nodded without argument, glad for the excuse to retreat. Returning to camp, my gaze constantly swept the surrounding trees. The claw marks loomed clearly in my mind, inexplicable, unsettling. Flathead National Forest had always felt familiar, safe even, but now something was off, changed in a way I couldn't understand. And deep down, I knew our hunt had become something else entirely. We didn't speak much for the rest of the afternoon. Dad cleaned his rifle again, carefully inspecting each part, and I busied myself reinforcing our camp perimeter. We knew bears roamed these woods, but I'd hunted around them all my life without ever feeling this uneasy. When the sun dropped behind the ridges, shadows filled the valley quickly. A thick twilight settled around us, deeper and heavier than usual. As darkness crept in, we lit a small fire, letting the flames eat slowly at the logs while we listened closely to the quiet forest. Dad broke the silence first. Maybe a mountain lion dragged the meat off, he offered weakly, trying to convince himself more than me. You saw those claw marks, I replied quietly. I don't know any cat that tall. His expression hardened, a mixture of concern and frustration. Could have climbed. Neither of us believed it. Around midnight, a strange low hooting echoed from somewhere far off in the trees. Dad and I exchanged glances, both of us stiffening in our seats. The calls rose and fell slowly, an unfamiliar haunting sound that made my gut tighten. Ever heard that before? I whispered. Dad shook his head slowly. No animal I know makes that sound. We checked the fire, and Dad moved closer, gripping his rifle. He kept scanning the darkness, eyes narrowed in concentration. My mouth had gone dry, every muscle in my body tensed for something unseen. When the calls finally faded, I stood up shakily to relieve myself, stepping behind the tent toward the creek. My flashlight beam skimmed the earth near my feet, revealing deep depressions pressed into the soft moss along the stream bank. I froze instantly. They were footprints, huge and elongated, too wide and too deep to belong to a person, too oddly shaped for a bear. They stretched off into the darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. I hurried back to Dad, pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't need to say anything. My expression must have told him enough. He grabbed his own flashlight and followed me back to the prints, staring silently at them. He knelt, tracing their edges with his finger, a puzzled frown creasing his forehead. What made these? I finally asked, voice strained. I don't know, he said, standing abruptly. We shouldn't stay another night. I agreed silently, my heart racing. Neither of us said it, but we knew it was too dark to hike out safely now. We'd have to wait until dawn. We returned to the fire and sat quietly, rifles across our knees. Time crawled slowly forward, every minute stretching endlessly. Occasionally, twigs snapped softly around our perimeter, each small sound making my heart skip and my grip tighten around the rifle stock. Near dusk the following evening, Dad abruptly lifted his hand, pointing toward the creek. I looked up, catching sight of a dark shape crouched low across the stream, partly obscured by bushes. Broad shoulders hunched forward, the figure was unmoving, hair matted and dark, blending seamlessly with the brush. I raised my rifle slowly, taking a deep breath to steady my shaking hands. Through the scope, I saw only darkness and shadows, no clear outline. Take the shot, Dad whispered urgently. I squeezed the trigger, the rifle's report shattering the stillness. The shadow immediately erupted into motion, disappearing silently into the dense trees. There was no crashing sound, no breaking branches, just silence. Impossible silence. We both stood there, rifles trained uselessly into the darkening woods. Did you hit it? Dad finally asked, his voice barely audible. I'm not sure, I replied, breathing heavily. It was fast. As night fell completely, we retreated to the tent, zipping it shut tightly. Neither of us mentioned sleep. Hours passed in agonizing silence until sometime around 2 a.m, when soft, heavy footsteps approached. They circled slowly, methodically, around the tent. We listened helplessly, our breathing shallow, muscles aching from staying so still. Then the footsteps stopped, replaced by low, throaty grunts, almost inquisitive sounds, directly outside the thin fabric walls of our shelter. I could hear deep breaths just inches from my head, the noise unsettlingly close. Dad silently clicked the safety off his rifle. We waited, neither daring to move. Eventually, the footsteps retreated into the night, quiet and controlled. Dad slowly exhaled, lowering his rifle slightly. We didn't say another word, counting the endless minutes until dawn would finally allow us to leave. Whatever was out there wasn't done yet, and we both knew we had to get out, before it returned. Dawn finally broke, washing pale gray light over our camp. Neither Dad nor I had managed a minute of sleep. Every muscle in my body ached from hours of rigid tension, gripping the rifle tight enough to leave my knuckles sore. We didn't discuss anything, words felt pointless now. Our only shared goal was clear, getting out. We packed quickly, shoving gear haphazardly into our backpacks, barely pausing to secure our rifles. My eyes constantly scanned the tree line, searching for movement. I caught Dad doing the same, his face grim. The valley was utterly silent, oppressive in its lack of normal sounds. Climbing higher toward the granite ridges above the basin, we sought open ground for a clearer satellite signal. Dad held the GPS beacon, tapping it impatiently as the signal flickered between weak and non-existent. Come on, he muttered, frustration clear in his voice. Finally, a steady green light blinked. We immediately sent a distress signal requesting extraction. After a few minutes of unbearable waiting, the device vibrated softly, confirming the rescue plane was on its way from Kalispell. Relief flooded through me, but the tension didn't fully ease. I still felt watched. Something followed us from below, hidden within the dense timber. Every rustle of branches or distant snap of twigs made me flinch. Dad kept a tight grip on his rifle, glancing nervously downward. As we continued climbing, the landscape became steeper. Exposed rock, breaking through patches of scrub and scattered pines. Each step felt heavier, slower, fatigue battling against adrenaline. Finally, we reached an open, rocky clearing overlooking a small alpine lake, a suitable landing zone for the float plane. Dad signaled our position with his bright orange jacket, waving it vigorously. After a few anxious minutes, we heard the distant drone of an engine. The sound grew louder, echoing against the mountain walls. A small plane banked gently toward the lake. I exhaled deeply, relief finally outweighing my anxiety. But as the aircraft made a low pass over the lake, my gaze drifted back down toward the basin we'd just left. Something strange caught my eye. Directly below us, clearly visible from our vantage point, hung our missing elk carcass, suspended high in a tree, at least 15 feet above the ground. My stomach twisted sharply. The gutted animal swayed gently, secured by its hind legs in an impossible, disturbing display. No bear or mountain lion could have done something like that. Dad followed my stare and cursed softly under his breath. "What kind of animal does that?" he murmured, almost to himself. We didn't speak again as the plane circled once more, before gently touching down on the surface of the lake. Slinging our packs, we hurried down toward the shoreline. My boots splashed through shallow water as we scrambled onto the pontoon and climbed hastily into the tiny cockpit. The pilot, an older man named Ray, shot us a curious glance, clearly sensing our urgency but wise enough not to ask questions. He pushed the throttle forward, and soon we lifted off, leaving the haunted valley far behind. Only once we were airborne did my shoulders finally relax, the tension draining from me in waves. Beside me, Dad stared silently out the window, his face set in stony silence. After a long moment, he spoke quietly. "It knew exactly what it was doing, Luke. No animal does that out of instinct." I nodded slowly, unable to reply. He was right. Whatever we'd encountered back there in the Flathead National Forest wasn't simply wild. It had intention, intelligence. After landing safely in Kalispell, we reported what we'd experienced to a ranger station near the airport. But our account was met with polite skepticism and nodding smiles. No one followed up. We didn't insist. They wouldn't believe us anyway. On the drive back to Missoula, Dad's expression stayed thoughtful and distant. Eventually he sighed heavily, eyes focused straight ahead. "I don't think we should ever go back there," he said quietly. "No," I replied softly, staring at the passing trees outside the truck's window. "Never again." Weeks later, we heard through a hunting forum online that another party had found the carcass we'd abandoned. The elk bones were exactly where we'd left them, but the skull was missing entirely, and fresh claw marks had appeared, higher, deeper, more deliberate. We never talked about Flathead again, but sometimes, late at night when sleep refused to come, I'd stare into the dark corners of my bedroom, remembering that thing circling our tent, breathing just inches away, waiting, silent, watching. It had been 6 years since Dean disappeared into Olympic National Forest. He'd vanished along the Bogachiel River Trail, a popular hike near Solduck River, known for its rugged terrain and dense woods. Dean spent 27 days lost before rangers found him alive, barefoot, and wrapped in someone else's sleeping bag, nearly 10 miles off trail. He'd never explained what happened, never answered our questions, and soon after, he drifted away from our lives altogether. Then, Out of nowhere, Dean called me. "I need to go back, Sam," he said. "To face it." I knew instantly that it meant the trail, the woods, whatever he'd found out there. I'd spent years hoping Dean would eventually talk, but he'd always refused. Now something had changed. Liv was skeptical when I told her, but insisted she come along, partly out of concern and partly curiosity, I suspect. After all, she'd been just as haunted as I had. It was early morning when we drove into the forest, shadows still stretching across the narrow roads. Dean sat silently beside me, staring straight ahead. Liv glanced at him from the back seat, concerned. Dean had always been reserved, but now he was barely recognizable. He'd aged more than the rest of us, his hair thinner, eyes hollow, face drawn and weary. Something else was different too, a restlessness beneath his skin. At the trailhead, we unloaded our gear. Dean stood for a moment, staring at the sign marking the path toward the Bogachel River. His hands shook slightly as he tightened his pack straps. "You okay, Dean?" Liv asked quietly. He blinked, startled by her voice. "Yeah," he mumbled, almost too softly to hear. "Let's go." The hike was difficult but familiar at first. Wide paths, a steady incline, lush ferns along the trail. Liv kept up conversation to fill the heavy silence. Dean responded briefly, monosyllabic, his attention always somewhere else, ahead or off to the side, as though he expected someone or something to appear suddenly from the brush. Several miles in, we reached the spot where Dean had originally vanished. A small wooden post marked the intersection with a disused trail that had once cut toward Appleton Pass, but was now overgrown and almost indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. Dean stopped dead, eyes locked on the narrow path disappearing into thick brush. "This was it," he said, voice flat. Liv looked uneasy. I felt it too, a strange sense of displacement, like standing at the edge of a great void. Something was off about this place, something I couldn't pinpoint. Dean crouched, tracing his fingers along the ground, as if trying to recall some crucial detail. He glanced back toward us, eyes darkening. We shouldn't stop here. We continued for another hour, following the main trail deeper toward Slide Lake. Dean moved ahead, faster now, urgent in his stride, occasionally glancing back with a look of quiet desperation. Liv caught my arm, whispering nervously, "Sam, I don't think we should have agreed to this." "We owe it to him," I said softly, trying to reassure myself as much as her. But the words felt empty. At dusk, we made camp near an abandoned fire ring, the stones half buried by years of neglect. Liv set up her tent, while I tried to convince Dean to rest, but he shook his head sharply. "I'm sleeping outside," he insisted, voice strained. "It doesn't want barriers this time." Liv shot me an alarmed look. I said nothing, unsure how to handle the situation. We ate dinner silently around a small fire. Dean hardly touched his food, staring intensely into the trees, his eyes flicking toward shadows cast by the firelight. Occasionally he mumbled something under his breath, a series of disconnected words I couldn't catch clearly. Later, sleep wouldn't come. Anxiety pressed on my chest, heavy and inescapable. I stepped out quietly, noticing Dean was gone from the fireside. Fear tightened my throat as I scanned the darkness. Finally, I saw him, standing barefoot by the riverbank staring at the black, silent water. He whispered urgently into the darkness, his words fragmented, sharp-edged. I strained to hear, approaching cautiously until I was close enough to make out his voice clearly. "No," he was saying desperately. "No, I'm here now. I told you I'd come back." I froze, afraid to interrupt, not knowing who or what he might be speaking to. Before I could react, Dean turned suddenly, eyes wide and glassy, illuminated briefly in moonlight. "You shouldn't be here, Sam," he whispered hoarsely. "You never should have come." A chill crawled down my spine as he brushed past, heading back toward camp without another word. I stood alone, heart pounding, staring into the endless dark of the forest around us. We broke camp early the next morning, none of us having slept much. Dean hadn't said another word since the strange moment by the riverbank, but his silence was somehow worse. The trail narrowed, the forest thickened, and each step forward felt heavier, more reluctant. Liv moved closer to me as we walked, casting worried glances toward Dean, who had drifted ahead of us. Occasionally he paused and tilted his head, as if listening for something we couldn't hear. The more he did this, the tighter my stomach twisted. "You hear anything?" Liv whispered. "Nothing," I said, straining to listen past the rustling leaves, my heart beating in my ears. "Just trees." By midday, the tension was palpable. Dean was muttering again, quiet fragments of conversation that seemed directed toward someone we couldn't see. He spoke softly, urgently, repeating phrases I didn't understand. His pace quickened, each step pushing deeper into wilderness that grew increasingly unfamiliar. I caught Liv's anxious glance again. "Dean, maybe we should slow down," I called. He ignored me, stepping faster. We hurried to keep pace, but after another mile, Dean suddenly froze in place, eyes fixed on something in the distance. When Liv and I caught up, I saw what held his gaze. A large moss-covered tree marked deeply with symbols. Jagged carvings that seemed both ancient and disturbingly fresh. The same angular spiral we'd seen before, only larger, more aggressive in appearance. "Dean, what is this?" I asked cautiously. His fingers traced the carvings, mouth moving silently. Liv tugged gently at his arm. "Dean, please." He jerked away violently, his expression darkening. "It's the way back. I need to finish this." I exchanged a helpless glance with Liv. Her eyes widened, terrified. She mouthed silently, "We need to leave." Before I could respond, Dean walked off again, head lowered, movements erratic. We followed carefully, but soon realized he was leading us away from the established trail, deeper into a maze of fallen trees, overgrown brush, and tangled roots. Shadows lengthened around us, sunlight fading into a muted twilight that seemed to come too soon. Liv reached for my hand, gripping it tightly. "Sam, he's losing it. We need to stop him." Ahead, Dean halted again, this time collapsing abruptly to his knees. He pressed his hands to his head, rocking slightly. "It's too loud," he groaned. "Too many voices. I shouldn't have brought you." I knelt beside him. "Dean, we can turn back. It's not too late." He raised his face, pale and haunted. "It won't let us." A sudden noise behind us made Liv jump. A heavy rustling, the crack of a branch, something shifting weight through the trees. It moved just out of sight, circling slowly. Dean's eyes widened, focused now with raw fear. "It followed us," he whispered, voice trembling. "I told you." "Dean, what followed us?" I demanded. But he didn't answer, staring into the dim woods around us, unblinking. Liv tugged at my sleeve frantically, panic swelling in her eyes. "I saw something," she whispered, breathless. "It moved like a person, right there behind those trees." "Stay here," I said, stepping carefully toward where she pointed. My pulse thundered as I peered into the shadows, trying desperately to see clearly. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, yet an oppressive presence pressed down on me, heavy and watchful. Suddenly, Dean screamed behind me. I spun, heart slamming, to find Liv struggling with him, desperately trying to hold him back as he clawed at the ground, frantic. "Dean!" I shouted, running toward them. His voice cracked, breaking apart into sobs. "I promised I'd come back. It said it would take me, but not you." "Dean, who?" Liv cried. "Who are you talking about?" His eyes rolled back, mouth opening in a silent cry. Liv gasped, releasing him as he collapsed to the dirt, shaking violently. Above us, the trees shuddered from something heavy passing swiftly overhead, branches snapping. I couldn't see it clearly, but its movement was undeniable, something large, something real. Dean went still, breathing raggedly. Slowly, he sat up, staring blankly toward the tree line. He looked past me as if I no longer existed. "It wants you," he said in a voice I barely recognized. "I'm sorry." "Dean?" But he was on his feet again, stumbling into the brush without another word. Liv tried to grab him, but he shoved her away, nearly knocking her down. She caught herself on a nearby tree, breathing heavily. "He's gone," she whispered. "Sam, he's gone." "Not yet," I said firmly, though my voice shook. "We have to find him." From somewhere in the forest, Dean's voice rose again, distant, muffled, calling urgently into the gathering darkness. But he wasn't speaking to us. He was speaking to something else, something hidden among the trees. Something that answered him back. Dean vanished into the dark faster than we could follow. I called his name until my throat felt raw, but only silence replied. Liv stood beside me, trembling, her eyes wide and shining in the fading twilight. "We can't follow him, Sam," she said finally, her voice thin and shaky. "We'll get lost." "We can't just leave him out here," I argued, though my own voice sounded uncertain. "Not again." She placed a hand on my shoulder, gripping it firmly. "We'll get help. He's gone somewhere we can't reach." I stared into the dark forest, the shapes of trees blending into shadow. I could still hear Dean's voice echoing faintly, calling out to something neither of us could see. The sound filled me with dread, but I knew Liv was right. Staying longer meant risking the same fate. Reluctantly, we turned back, tracing our steps through tangled underbrush toward the trail we'd left hours earlier. Every rustle in the darkness, every snap of twigs sent jolts of adrenaline racing through me. Liv's breathing grew ragged, uneven, her pace faltering. The forest seemed impossibly unfamiliar now, each tree identical to the last, our path constantly shifting beneath our feet. After what felt like hours, we reached familiar ground, a barely visible marker sign pointing toward the main trail. Liv exhaled sharply, relief clear in her expression. "We're close," she whispered. We moved quickly, spurred by urgency and fear. But as we rounded a bend in the trail, Liv suddenly froze, staring directly into the thick growth of brush ahead. She grabbed my arm, her fingernails biting into my skin. "Do you see her?" she breathed, barely audible. "Who?" Her hand trembled as she pointed. My heart slammed painfully as I followed her gaze. Standing motionless among the trees, staring directly at us, was Liv, or something identical to her. Its face expressionless, eyes cold and empty, skin pale and ghostly beneath the moonlight. Liv gasped sharply, stepping backward. "That's her. That's who I saw last night, Sam. It's me." My pulse hammered loudly in my ears. "That's not possible." The figure tilted its head slightly, eyes never blinking. It stepped forward once, deliberately mirroring Liv's own fearful posture. I couldn't speak. Terror rooted me in place. "Run," Liv whispered, voice strained. "Now!" She turned, dragging me along as we sprinted down the trail, branches and roots tearing at our clothes, the darkness closing in around us. Behind, footsteps followed steadily, always just out of sight, matching our pace but never gaining ground. Liv's sobbing breath echoed beside me, each step desperate, driven by pure instinct. Eventually, exhausted and nearly collapsing, we emerged at a campground just beyond the trailhead. A faint, reassuring glow came from the distant parking lot, our vehicle still waiting exactly where we'd left it. We stumbled forward, gasping, our legs burning. When we finally reached my car, Liv sank down beside it, shaking uncontrollably. I fumbled my phone out, relieved when it finally caught a signal. My hands shook violently as I dialed 911. "Help," I managed hoarsely. "Our friend's lost. Olympic National Forest, Bagachiel Trail, please." The dispatcher's calm voice assured me help was coming, but my mind couldn't settle. Every sound, every movement at the edges of the parking lot made my stomach twist. Liv remained silent, her eyes locked onto the darkness beyond the campsite, frozen in fear. When I finally hung up, she whispered, "I'm not going back in there. Not ever." I nodded numbly, barely able to speak. Neither am I. In the days that followed, authorities combed the forest thoroughly. They found Dean's pack and jacket neatly folded at the base of an old cedar tree, miles from any trail, but nothing else. No signs of struggle, no footprints leading away. Dean was simply gone. Weeks later, a park ranger called me, his voice cautious and unsure. "We picked something up last night on an emergency channel," he said hesitantly. "It sounded like your friend Dean." I gripped the phone tightly, knuckles white. "What did he say?" The ranger hesitated. "He asked for help, said he came back, but didn't know why he was still there. We traced the signal to a remote ravine, but our teams searched it thoroughly. There's no one there." My throat tightened painfully. "What does that mean?" "I honestly don't know," the ranger admitted quietly. "But we're keeping the channel open, just in case." Days passed. Then on a rainy evening, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from an unknown number. Hands trembling, I listened. Static crackled faintly before a familiar voice whispered, tired and lost. Don't come back. It was Dean. Growing up in Cedar Heights always felt suffocating. It was one of those cities where everything moved too fast and felt too tight, like the whole world was breathing down your neck. I didn't mind people, but crowds gave me headaches. Noise made me anxious. Cedar Heights was noise, and crowds distilled into their purest forms. My little brother, Luca, was the opposite. He loved attention, laughter, and the constant buzz of energy around him. Maybe it was because he was only 12, still untouched by anxiety, unscarred by the things people could do to each other. Luca had an innocence I envied, an optimism that drove his teachers crazy and made my parents smile. His latest obsession was filmmaking. He'd recently been assigned a 6th grade movie project, and he threw himself into it like he was Spielberg himself. When my parents decided we'd visit our cousins out in Ashmill so Luca could film his project, I felt immediate relief. Ashmill was different, small, remote, tucked away in the woods near El Dorado National Forest, northeast of Sacramento. My cousins Ryan and Reese lived there with their parents on 5 wooded acres. The twins were as hyper as Luca, always inventing elaborate games and pranks. But unlike the chaos of Cedar Heights, their antics felt contained, safer somehow, because the thick pine trees absorbed sound and the earth softened footsteps. As we turned onto their winding gravel driveway, I saw Luca clutching his camcorder like it was the key to his future. Before our parents even shut off the engine, he leaped out, calling for the twins. I reluctantly followed behind. They needed a cameraman, and somehow that became my responsibility. I'd intended to hang back inside, away from the commotion, but Luca had begged me with eyes so wide I couldn't refuse. "Marcus, please. You're better with a camera than anyone." So there I was, trudging behind them through a maze of shadowy trees, half-heartedly filming their fantasy epic. Luca had draped cheap cloaks over their shoulders and armed each cousin with plastic swords. They laughed as they ran through the trees, yelling scripted lines and improvising ridiculous plot twists. "Watch out, evil wizard!" Reese shouted, swinging his sword at empty air. Luca giggled hysterically, directing with exaggerated hand motions. Ryan did his best villain impression, raising his hands dramatically and laughing in a voice deeper than his own. The deeper we went into the woods, the more uneasy I became. At first, it was subtle, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the air growing cooler despite the sunlight filtering through the canopy. Shadows stretched long and uneven on the forest floor, making every step uncertain. I tried to dismiss the feeling, attributing it to anxiety or exhaustion from keeping pace with 3 energetic kids. My breathing quickened, hands trembling as I adjusted my grip on the camcorder, doing my best to keep the shots steady. Finally, I called out, "Guys, let's take a break. I need something to drink." "Fine," Luca sighed dramatically, pretending to faint against a tree. "Marcus can't keep up." The twins laughed, tossing their swords down. "Bring us juice, too," Ryan shouted, his voice echoing strangely. Back inside the house, the stillness was comforting. My heart rate slowed as I opened the fridge, reaching for the orange juice. Just as my fingers touched the cold carton, a scream ripped through the air from outside. It wasn't playful or exaggerated. It was raw, high-pitched, and filled with a terror that froze me in place. "Luca?" My voice cracked. I dropped the juice carton on the kitchen floor, and it burst open, spreading a pool of orange liquid at my feet. I sprinted out the back door, my heart slamming against my ribcage. "Luca! Ryan! Reese!" My voice was swallowed by the trees. The clearing where they'd been filming seconds earlier was completely empty. The toy swords lay scattered, abandoned, the cloaks fluttering softly in the breeze. "Luca!" My shout was desperate now, fear creeping into every syllable. I spun around, eyes scanning the tree line for movement. Nothing moved. The woods were perfectly, dreadfully still. I sprinted back inside, slamming open doors and screaming for our parents. Within minutes, my parents and the twins' parents joined me, their panic mirroring my own. We shouted until our throats hurt, scoured every inch of the 5-acre property, and called out repeatedly. The woods gave us nothing in return. Police arrived within the hour, their flashlights cutting through dusk that settled heavily over Ashmill. Volunteers and search dogs followed shortly after, methodically moving through the underbrush. Hours passed, cold dread building with each fruitless moment. That night, as I stood shivering beneath the yellow porch lights, listening to the muffled sobs of our parents speaking with officers, I looked back toward the woods. A chill crawled up my spine, and I had the distinct, stomach-churning certainty that something terrible had reached out from that darkness and taken them. I just didn't know yet how right I was. After 3 agonizing weeks of waiting, the call finally came. A hiker found their bodies in Crooked Pine State Park, 29 miles northeast of Ashmill. The sheriff was careful with his words, but I knew what he was trying not to say. Ryan and Reese were dead, their bodies torn apart, mutilated beyond anything the sheriff's deputies had ever witnessed. Luca, my little brother, was found hanging from a tree limb above a shallow stream, dressed in the same cloak he'd made for his movie. The news broke something inside me. Nothing felt real, not the memorial service, the whispered condolences, or the casseroles left on our doorstep. Especially not the day the detective handed me Luca's camcorder, wrapped in clear plastic like a piece of evidence from a nightmare. He'd said it contained footage of the boy's last moments, that the police had already reviewed it. But when I asked about the details, he just shook his head and told me it was better not to know. That night, unable to sleep, I stared at the camcorder sitting on my desk. The small device seemed to mock me, daring me to watch what no one else would describe. Finally, desperate for answers, I unwrapped it from its plastic shell and turned it on. My hands shook as I pressed play. The video began innocently. Luca's voice filled the speakers, excitedly directing Ryan and Reese through the scenes we'd filmed that day. There they were, playing heroes and villains, laughing and charging through the trees with plastic swords held high. I recognized each location, the familiar clearing, the fallen log, the large pine stump they'd pretended was their throne. Then abruptly, the video changed. Static crackled loudly, making me flinch. The footage flickered, went dark, then returned, grainier and more distorted. Luca's voice was low and fearful, whispering, "Did you hear that?" My pulse quickened. The boys turned toward the forest. Something moved subtly among the trees, a shifting shadow, barely distinguishable. Luca zoomed in, trying to get a better look. I leaned closer to the screen, eyes squinting, heart thudding. Suddenly, Reese screamed. It was the same chilling scream I'd heard from the kitchen. On screen, the boys bolted, the camera shaking wildly as Luca ran. Branches whipped past the lens, blurring into frantic streaks. The camera caught glimpses of Ryan's terrified face, Reese stumbling, and Luca's heavy breathing punctuated by panicked gasps. Behind them, something followed, silent, persistent, visible only in flickering glimpses. The screen abruptly went black. Words flashed onto the display. "I can't save them." A low, distorted melody began playing like a music box unwinding slowly in reverse. It made my skin crawl. Then the footage resumed, clearer but more horrifying than before. Ryan and Reese appeared, tied against trees. Both were sobbing uncontrollably. My breath caught in my throat as I saw them struggle uselessly against their bonds. Behind them, something slowly moved into view. My stomach twisted. The figure was humanoid but grotesquely distorted. Arms far too long, fingers gnarled and crooked, its body thin enough to see ribs through mottled skin. Its face was blank except for an impossibly wide, gaping mouth. The camera's audio filled with a strange, buzzing frequency, overwhelming and disorienting. The creature began hurting them, moving with jerky motions, precise yet unnatural. It pulled, twisted, and tore. Ryan and Reese's screams cracked the tiny speakers, mixing with static. My vision blurred with tears, nausea rising in my chest. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I had to understand. Finally, the camera jerked violently away from the scene, turning toward Luca himself. He stared directly into the lens, face oddly calm at first. Then, slowly, his expression distorted. His skin seemed to stretch, jaw unhinging unnaturally, eyes rolling backward. The screen glitched and warped as if reality itself was fraying. Then the footage cut sharply once more, to Luca hanging from the noose. The image lingered silently for several seconds, swaying slightly. The video stopped abruptly, plunging the room back into suffocating silence. My body trembled uncontrollably. I stumbled from my desk and vomited into the trash can by my bed. My mind spun, overwhelmed by what I'd just witnessed. Frantically, I rewound the camcorder, desperate to confirm what I'd seen. But now the footage was gone. The screen displayed only static, white noise filling the room. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat, curled against the wall, staring at the now silent camcorder, haunted by images I'd never be able to erase. Days passed in a blur. Driven by restless desperation, I began searching online for similar cases around Ashmill. The authorities wouldn't acknowledge any connection, dismissing my questions as paranoia or grief. But after digging through local forums, news archives, and old records, I found a retired game warden named Dale McKinney, who lived near Sly Park. Reluctantly, he agreed to talk to me. Sitting in his dim living room, Dale spoke quietly. Over the past 50 years, 5 other children had vanished from the woods around Sly Park. Each disappearance mirrored what had happened to Luca and the twins, children playing alone, recovered days or weeks later near water, their deaths brutal and inexplicable. But what chilled me most was Dale's final confession. 2 cases involved recovered footage. Both videos disappeared, confiscated by investigators and never released. Families were told the tapes showed nothing. The police buried the truth to avoid panic. No one had ever pushed further. I left Dale's house numb and hollow, the weight of reality pressing down. Whatever I'd seen on Luca's camcorder wasn't just a random tragedy. It was something older, something hidden. I decided right then that I couldn't ignore it. I owed it to Luca, to Ryan, to Reese. I owed it to myself, and I was going back. I couldn't let it go. Weeks passed, and every day the memories of that footage clawed deeper into my mind. My parents watched me with concerned eyes, whispering about therapy and medication, but they didn't understand. It wasn't something a therapist could fix. It was something I had to confront. Late one evening, without telling anyone, I packed a backpack with a flashlight, a backup camcorder, and a hunting knife from the garage. Then I took my parents' car keys and drove the familiar route back to Ashmill. The night was clear but oppressive. The forest loomed on either side of the winding road, my headlights barely piercing the dark. The further I drove, the more my anxiety grew, a tight knot forming in my stomach. I parked at the trailhead leading into Crooked Pine State Park. The area was deserted, lit only by moonlight filtering through the trees. I grabbed the backpack and stepped onto the narrow path, flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. Each step forward felt heavier. I retraced the route from Luca's video, recognizing each twisted root and jagged stone. The forest was quiet, except for my breathing, quick and uneven. My mind raced with fragments of memory. The creature's gaping mouth, Ryan and Reese tied and helpless, Luca's distorted face. A high-pitched hum filled the air, soft at first, barely audible. As I moved deeper into the woods, it intensified into a harsh buzzing that made my teeth ache. My flashlight flickered, and I slapped the handle nervously, desperate to keep it steady. The path narrowed, branches scratching at my arms and face. I stumbled forward, driven more by instinct than logic. Then I saw the stream ahead, the same shallow creek where Luca's body had been found. My heart thudded violently. I stopped at the stream's edge. Everything felt wrong here. The air seemed colder, heavier, charged with an uncomfortable tension. I scanned the area, flashlight beam shaking as I moved slowly along the bank. A whisper floated past my ears, almost inaudible. Luca's voice, distant and afraid. I spun around, pointing the flashlight wildly, but saw nothing. My pulse hammered relentlessly. I called his name, my voice cracking in desperation. Then, in the trees beyond the stream, something moved. My flashlight beam froze on the spot. The tall, thin figure from the footage stood motionless, half hidden behind a tree trunk. Its face was blank, empty aside from that same impossibly wide mouth stretching open silently. Terror shot through me, freezing me in place. The flashlight shook violently, the beam bouncing erratically across trees and ground. The creature shifted closer in short, unnatural jerks, movements that defied normal rhythm. A nauseating wave of dizziness rushed over me as the humming intensified, the sound now painfully loud. The backup camcorder in my bag suddenly activated itself, a mechanical whir startling me. With trembling hands, I pulled it from my backpack. The screen showed an impossible scene, the forest clearing, illuminated like daylight. I watched as Luca, Ryan, and Reese ran past the camera, screaming in horror. My own figure appeared on screen too, standing exactly where I stood now, holding this very camcorder. Confusion overwhelmed me. I glanced frantically around the clearing, seeing only darkness, but the camera screen clearly showed the daytime horror unfolding right here, right now. The figure continued its jerking approach on the screen, rapidly closing in behind the boys, reaching toward Luca's shoulder. "No!" I shouted reflexively, voice raw with panic. I hurled the camcorder at a rock, watching as the screen shattered and sparks burst from the plastic casing. The harsh humming stopped immediately, plunging the forest back into total silence. The creature stood only feet away now, motionless and watching. My flashlight steadied on it for a fraction of a second, illuminating its twisted limbs and gaunt frame. Then, suddenly and silently, it vanished back into the trees, leaving only emptiness. I collapsed onto my knees, gasping, my entire body trembling. I stayed there for what felt like hours, unable to move, listening to my own ragged breathing. As dawn broke, a ranger found me collapsed beside the stream. I must have blacked out, because I had no memory of the hours in between. I was brought home, weak,